Welcome back. Today we're going to continue with our exploration with TRIS tools, and in today's class we're going to see multi-screen thinking. Right? Multi-screen thinking was earlier known as system operators, and some people would like to refer to it as 9 windows, but then that is probably a very static representation of the concept of multi-screen thinking. Right? So today you're going to learn how we can use this multi-screen thinking to find out what it's all about and to see how it can help us solve problems. Multi-screen thinking, as the name suggests, involves more than one screen representing the frame of thought, right? And the standard form or the more general form of multi-screen thinking would have this 3x3 matrix, which most of you know there's this time dimension and also the systems dimension. This is the more familiar version of the multi-screen thinking. But the original form of multi-screen thinking, which Altshuler had devised, according to Nikolai Komenko, he said that there were 4 dimensions instead of just 2. And the other 2 dimensions, one is in terms of technology development. We normally think about the S-curve, right? So it's stage 1 to stage 4 that is represented. And another aspect of the multi-screen thinking would be to have a representation of an NT system, right? So these issues I can cover briefly in this class. If needed, we can explore how they can help us to come up with an innovative solution to existing problems. Let's now get hands-on practice in making use of the multi-screen thinking. Well, it's also referred to as multi-screen analysis because it allows the representation of snapshots of a system. Well, we are looking at the present image of the system alongside the past image and also a projected future image. Right? So having multiple images or snapshots of a system in parallel allows us to model in a much more effective way because, according to Altshuler, he says it takes a talent to be able to see some aspects of the past alongside the current characteristics of existing systems. Right? So we can take an example, and looking at an example, if you look at an example of a tree, right? So if we have a tree here, well, looking at the present dimension, we are looking at a tree. What would the tree have been in the past? Well, the tree would have been a seed, right? A seed would have been what grew into this tree now, right? So we have the seed as the past of the tree. And when we look at the temporal dimension, the tree could become some sort of a wood, and it could be made into a form of furniture, right? So just taking an example of a temporal dimension, we have the tree becoming furniture, right? So this is the first dimension. Now when we look at the subsystems and the supersystems dimension, right? Here we will see that the seed or the tree exists in a bigger environment. So we try to describe the bigger environment now, right? So what is the supersystem for the tree? The tree could exist, for example, in a forest, right? So the supersystem for the tree could be the forest, a collection of trees, right? Imagining that this is a traditional situation of the tree being planted in a forest or growing by itself in a forest, right? So in terms of the seed itself, the ecosystem could also be forest if it was in the forest, but it could have been a nursery, right? So this is something that in the past it could have been planted in a nursery and then replanted in a forest. It could be an artificial forest, real forest, right? So here we have the past and present representation. So when we look at in future, the tree is going to be a furniture, and this furniture could be used for a home or some sort of well, it could be for the specific market. And in this example, just to illustrate how we use the multi-screen thinking, what I will do is I will just point out that the furniture is being used in a home, right? A home could be locally or could be abroad, right? So it's part of a home, right? So this two aspects of the system and super systems are already covered. Now we look at the specific aspects of the components of this tree, right? Now what we want to do is, well, there are a variety of angles to look at what is the constituent of a tree, right? So a tree could have a stem, could have roots. I mean, if let's say the roots served a particular purpose and that was the cause or that was the intention for us to model this engineering system, then we would represent the roots. But we could also, I mean, if we were looking at molecular levels, and you could go into some well, minute aspect of what made up the tree, could be the cells, or I mean, it could be even going into the DNA as well, right? So in a way, you can represent well, some aspect of the tree, and in this case, okay, let's say we are looking at the roots, right? So if we look at the roots in the past, what would the roots have been, right? The roots could have been, well, some sort of a genetic representation. So it could be the genetic representation here. And what will happen to the roots, right? Now, if the tree becomes furniture, then, well, there need to be some way of, well, repurposing the roots, right? So in this case, well, if there was no specific way, well, by looking at this multi-screen representation, we can just say, well, there could be a potential to repurpose the roots to turn it into some sort of artifact, right? So this could be a start of a business where the roots could be turned into artifacts, and these artifacts could be marketed or could be turned into some products, right? So as you can see here, all these aspects of multi-screen thinking, they are all related, they're all connected to one another. And well, as we realize that there could be some concerns about the artifact in terms of well, the availability of roots, then we may need to look at what makes up these roots, right? Or we can even look at what could we do to ensure that the roots are preserved, right? So it is possible to look at multiple facets of the problem of the engineering system in parallel to be able to ensure that a complete modeling of any problem solving scenario could be handled in an appropriate manner. Let us look at the multi-screen thinking, which is a very widely used TRIS tool, right? So multi-screen thinking provides multifaceted view of an engineering system. And let us just take an example, and we can take an example of the postal system, right? So if we look at the postal system, right, what is this postal system? I mean, it's a service that's being used for ensuring that messages get transferred across from one place to another. right? What was this postal system before, right? So when we ask about the postal system, I mean, there was a physical movement of tablets in the past, right? So, I mean, the tablet would have been very heavy, right? So there was a kind of a messaging system. I will say there was a messaging system, but it was a physical messaging system, right? So that was what, with physical artifacts being carried by one person to another. I mean, there was also a point where there were scripts which was made of bark or wood, which was used for transfer of messages, right? So what we want to do is, in this example, we want to try to project what will the postal system look like in the future, right? So by using this multi-screen thinking, it is possible for us to project what a system would be transformed to become in, with respect to the changes in the environment in terms of emerging technologies, and also to ensure that the communities are going to be served as well as possible, right? So we will see in terms of the past, present, and future dimension here. So we see the postal system is going to become something much more mobile. I mean, it could be email, but you see, the thing is, email system is already here. So is that going to be something that will exist for a very long time? I mean, we know that things are going to change, right? So we can imagine that a kind of a micro messaging system. I mean, it could be a micro messaging system. I mean, it could even be some form of a messages that are wholly transparent, or I mean invisible. I mean, in a way, some sort of a mind connection in terms of how someone generates a thought pattern and then transmits. So in a way, we can only envisage some future system, right? So here, I mean, it could be, I mean, we could take an example of a mindware messaging, right? So imagine that we are trying to invent this messaging services. So what we will do is, I will just now move these postal services over here, and let's have electronic mail over here. So we are familiar with these two types of system, and which will lead to a future type of mindware messaging system. So you can see that the representation tool here is flexible enough for me to play around with the snapshot in time that we want to model in the temporal dimension. So you just saw an example of how I would be able to do that. Now, when we look at the postal services, what do you consider as its super system? Because this postal system existed in a community's system, which was, I mean, more ancient. I mean, where, I mean, the relationships were very physical. I mean, there were addresses in the real world, right? So there was a kind of a real world addressing system. That was the super system for the postal services as it was provided. Well, it still exists today, right? So when it comes to the super system for the postal services, we see its real world addressing. What about email? Email, we find that there is, well, in the internet protocol, right, world, I mean, there are email addresses, and these are much more a logical form of addressing schemes, right? So I will just say internet-based addressing. Right? Addresses. Right? Now, what will happen to this addressing system? I mean, in a future mindware era, where, I mean, everyone would be an entity in a network of connected individuals, right? So it could be a new type of protocol. Now, if we are in the networking area, I mean, if we are looking at protocols for shaping future messaging services, then this is going to be an area for research that we may be involved in. So here we could have the identity base, right? So I will use the word identity-based addressing, right? And this could be a system that doesn't exist today. I mean, it's a kind of a imaginary system that we could shape, and we could do a brainstorming session just to look at what are potentials for influencing the shape of this to come, right? So with that, we already saw the super system and the system dimensions of this multi-screen thinking. Let's just go into the subsystems as well, right? Now, if we are looking at doing research in the postal services, we would like to explore some aspect of this postal system. I mean, we could look at the messages itself, or we could look at the interaction. So there are a number of components, and the component of interest would be one that is most relevant to the research or the study that we are trying to look at. Okay. Well, in this case, if you want to say in the postal system, what sort of interactions took place? I mean, the interactions was between the paper version of messages or parcels that was placed into mailboxes, and then these mailboxes were connected to one another through an addressing scheme, right? So we could just say, well, if we are in future looking at providing services for better way of interacting between individuals, now we can just say post boxes here. So these post boxes was replaced in the email era by mailboxes, right? I mean, this all existed in servers, and I mean, these days they are still around, but then we hardly even consider these things as a major concern, because I mean the technology is already very stable, and I mean we all take it as part of life these days, right? So in the future, how can we explore in a identity-based addressing era with mindware messaging, what sort of messaging box would we look at, right? This is going to shape the future of applications, the future of systems that we are going to develop in the near future, right? So I will just put a question mark here, and this will give us room to try to design something that would be a pioneering initiative, right? So this was just an exercise for us to see how this powerful tool, this multi-screen windows, right, multi-screen thinking or multi-screen strategy can be used to look into the future, right? So we had a peek into the future, and we didn't go into much details. It could be a starting point for a very well-structured brainstorming session. In Unimas, we make use of the multi-screen thinking for a variety of purposes. I mean, it is really appealing to new users of TRIS. I mean, they find that without a kind of a lengthy learning curve, they can just start modeling problems as multi-screen thinking. Right? Now, having this capability to model everything as systems and to look at this multi-screen representation, we are now able to work with multiple stakeholders, and we are able to design the vision for the future. And when we look at this vision for the future, we are able to consider the current circumstances, current limitations, while moving aspects of the actual concerns with what we are going to look at in future, right? So that's one of the things that could be done with this multi-screen thinking. But I've seen people use multi-screen thinking for storytelling, for exploring the logical connections between various aspects of different players who are involved in a single problem solving. So the potentials are immense, and we will see in future some of these usage with respect to the projects and problems that you are going to tackle. We have seen throughout our experience in the past two classes that the ability of TRIS to model everything as systems is an extremely powerful feature. And having seen the multi-screen thinking just now, where we are able to have a focus on aspects of system alongside with the aspects of supersystem and components, at the same time we are able to see what is going to happen to a product in future. This gives us with the structuring that is necessary to be able to perform what Schuler calls as talented thinking. Talented thinking is you're not only locked up in a time box of current, but you're able to see things beyond. You will explore what happens to a product in future if some activity were performed to it today, right? And what are the lessons that you can pick up from the past that will help to improve the product or its components is really the benefit or the asset that we will get by focusing on this wonderful tool.